January 26, 1945. 6 miles south of the ancient city of Colmar, France. The fog was a cold, wet shroud, clinging to the snow-covered ground and muffling all sound. Through the skeletal trees bordering the Riedwehr woods, Oberleutnant Erich Richter of the 2nd Mountain Division scanned the American lines with his Zeiss binoculars. What he saw made him smile. The Americans were ghosts, dug in along the edge of the forest, their positions thin and exposed. Richter's orders were simple. His company, supported by Panzer Grenadiers and Jagdpanther tank destroyers from the 716th Infantry Division, would spearhead an assault to break this fragile line, push through the village of Holtzwihr, and collapse the entire southern shoulder of the Allied salient, known as the Colmar Pocket. For weeks, the Americans had bled themselves white in this frozen hell. Now, it was Germany's turn to strike back. Richter lowered his binoculars and turned to his sergeant, a battle-hardened veteran of the Eastern Front. "Look at them," Richter said, his voice laced with contempt. "They send boys to do a man's work. This will be over by noon." The sergeant nodded, his gaze fixed on the quiet American foxholes. He couldn't see the soldiers themselves, only the occasional puff of frozen breath hanging in the air. He had no way of knowing that in one of those holes sat a boy who would single-handedly dismantle their entire division, a soldier whose appearance was a lie, whose unassuming frame hid a ferocity that would become the stuff of legend. The German forces began their final preparations, the low rumble of engines and the clatter of equipment barely audible through the dense fog. They were confident, professional, and utterly unaware that they were about to advance into the gun sight of the most decorated American soldier of the entire war. The story of that soldier began not in the frozen forests of France, but under the punishing sun of Hunt County, Texas. Audie Murphy was born into the suffocating poverty of a sharecropper's life, the 7th of 12 children. He was small for his age, with a quiet demeanor, and a face that seemed perpetually boyish. His childhood was a relentless struggle for survival, marked by hunger and hardship. He learned to hunt not for sport, but to put food on the table, becoming an exceptional marksman with a squirrel rifle out of sheer necessity. By the time he was a teenager, he looked younger than his years, a wiry, freckle-faced kid who weighed barely 100 pounds. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Murphy, like millions of other young American men, felt the call to serve. But the military didn't want him. He tried to enlist in the Marine Corps, but at 5 feet 5 inches and 110 pounds, he was flatly rejected for being underweight and too short. Undeterred, he tried the Army Paratroopers, only to be turned down again for the same reasons. A frustrated recruiter finally suggested the regular infantry, remarking that it was good enough for him. The army took him, but not without reservations. During basic training, his company commander tried to have him transferred to a cook and baker school, believing he was too small and frail for combat. Murphy refused, stubbornly insisting on his place in the infantry. He endured the grueling marches and the physically demanding drills, his quiet determination pushing his undersized body to its limits. His superiors saw a boy, but his fellow soldiers started to see something else. An unnerving calm under pressure and an almost preternatural skill with a rifle. He was assigned to Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, and shipped out to North Africa in early 1943. He was still a boy by all appearances, so young-looking that the veteran soldiers in his platoon took to calling him Baby. They soon learned their mistake. Murphy saw his first action during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. In the face of enemy fire, the quiet, unassuming kid from Texas transformed. He moved with an eerie composure, his marksmanship unerring. He quickly proved himself a natural combat soldier, earning a promotion to corporal after killing 2 Italian officers who were attempting to escape on horseback. His baptism by fire continued in the brutal slog up the Italian peninsula, at Salerno, across the Volturno River, and at the bloody Anzio beachhead. D. It was at Anzio that the legend began to form. During a German counterattack, Murphy's platoon was pinned down by intense machine gun fire. While his comrades hugged the dirt, Murphy calmly crawled out to an exposed position and single-handedly destroyed the German machine gun nest with rifle grenades. His actions saved his platoon from being overrun. By the time the 3rd Infantry Division landed in southern France as part of Operation Dragoon in August 1944, Murphy was a seasoned veteran and a sergeant, though his boyish face remained unchanged. Near Ramatuelle, his best friend Lattie Tipton was killed by a German soldier pretending to surrender. Murphy, enraged, went on a one-man rampage, single-handedly storming the German machine gun position, killing the entire crew, and then using their own weapon to eliminate several other nearby German positions. For this act of valour, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Promotions came rapidly, not through ambition but through attrition. As officers and NCOs fell around him, Murphy was repeatedly thrust into leadership roles. He was wounded in the hip, an injury that should have sent him home, but he returned to the front lines after a brief recovery. A battlefield commission promoting him to second lieutenant. By January 1945, he was given command of Company B. The company, which had started with over 200 men, was now reduced to just 19 combat-effective soldiers and 2 officers. Murphy was one of them. The brutal winter campaign in eastern France had taken a terrible toll. The men were exhausted, suffering from frostbite and combat fatigue. They fought in a landscape of frozen mud and splintered trees, where the cold was as much an enemy as the Germans. Murphy himself was a ghost of his former self. He had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. His eyes were sunken in his pale face, and he suffered from a recurring case of malaria. The boy who had been too small for the Marines was now a company commander, responsible for the lives of the few men he had left. His uniform hung loosely on his thin frame, and he looked more like a lost teenager than a battle-hardened officer. Yet his men would follow him anywhere. They had seen his quiet courage, his almost reckless disregard for his own safety, and his uncanny ability to survive. They trusted him implicitly because they knew that beneath the unassuming exterior was a core of pure, unyielding steel. On the morning of January 26th, Company B was dug in along the edge of a forest overlooking a wide, snow-covered field. Their mission was to hold this position at all costs, protecting the flank of the 15th Infantry Regiment as it attempted to capture the town of Holtzwihr. They were dangerously exposed, their thin line of foxholes the only thing standing between the German army and a catastrophic breakthrough. Attached to their position were 2 M10 tank destroyers, whose 3-inch guns provided their only meaningful anti-tank defense. As the cold morning fog settled over the field, a sense of dread hung in the air. The woods opposite them were unnaturally quiet. Murphy, peering into the grey mist, felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the Germans were coming. What he didn't know was that they were coming with the full force of a division, an avalanche of steel, and men aimed directly at his tiny, depleted company. The fate of the entire Colmar pocket rested on the shoulders of 19 exhausted men and 1 small, unassuming lieutenant from Texas. The first sound was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the frozen earth, a deep thrumming that was felt more than heard. It was the sound of heavy machinery on the move, the sound of impending death. Through the thick, swirling fog, dark shapes began to resolve themselves, monstrous silhouettes gliding over the snow with an unnatural grace. 6 Jagdpanther tank destroyers, their hulls low and wide, led the assault. Their long 88mm cannons, the most feared anti-tank guns of the war, extended like accusatory fingers, probing the mist. Flanking them, waves of German panzer grenadiers advanced in perfect skirmish lines, a moving wall of grey-green greatcoats that seemed to merge with the winter landscape. Oberleutnant Erich Richter watched from his command position behind the lead tan. A surge of professional pride swelling in his chest. This was German might, a symphony of steel and fire conducted with textbook precision. The American forward observers must have seen them at the same moment. The placid morning erupted. A barrage of American artillery shells screamed overhead. But the barrage was scattered and panicked, the gunners firing blind into the fog. The shells burst ineffectually in the open field, throwing up huge geysers of snow and black earth, but failing to slow the inexorable German advance. Richter allowed himself a small, contemptuous smile. "Pathetic," he muttered to his sergeant. "They are firing at ghosts." He raised his hand, and the German response was immediate and overwhelming. Mortars began their rhythmic, coughing reports, and heavy MG-42 Mach guns opened up. Their blistering rate of fire-stitching lines of tracer rounds through the trees where Company B was dug in. The assault was perfectly executed, a methodical, terrifying wave of destruction rolling toward the fragile American line. For Murphy and his 19 men, the world dissolved into a cacophony of noise and terror. The ground shook violently with the impact of mortar shells, and the air was filled with the vicious whip-crack of machine gun bullets snapping over their heads. Tree branches, sheared off by the incoming fire, rained down into their foxholes like deadly splinters. The two M10 tank destroyers, their crews finally spotting targets through the mist, opened fire. The sharp, defiant crack of their 3-inch guns was a welcome answer to the German onslaught. The gunner in the lead M10, a corporal from Ohio, squinted through his sight, laid the crosshairs on the center mass of an advancing Jagdpanther, and fired. The shell struck the lead German vehicle, and for a glorious second it shuddered to a halt, thick black smoke billowing from its engine compartment. A ragged cheer went up from the American line, a brief, desperate moment of hope in the swirling chaos. But the Germans were too numerous, their armour too thick, their advance too relentless. The remaining 5 Jagdpanthers adjusted their aim, their long cannons traversing with cold mechanical precision. The full weight of their firepower was brought to bear on the 2 exposed American vehicles. High-velocity armour-piercing shells tore through the air with a sound like ripping canvas. The first M10 was hit squarely in its thin side armour. The explosion was catastrophic, a blinding flash of orange and yellow that ripped the vehicle apart, sending its turrets spinning through the air like a discarded toy. There were no survivors. The second M10, positioned closer to Murphy's command post, was hit moments later. The shell slammed into its open-topped turret, turning the inside into a slaughterhouse of mangled steel and flesh. A second shell struck its tracks, shredding the metal links and immobilizing it. Then a third found its fuel tank. The vehicle erupted in flames. A geyser of fire and oily black smoke shot 20 feet into the air, the heat so intense it melted the snow in a wide circle around it. The surviving crewman, his uniform ablaze, scrambled out of the turret, screaming, and collapsed into the snow, a human torch extinguished by the cold. With their anti-tank support brutally eliminated in less than a minute, the men of Company B were left to face the German armour and infantry with only rifles, machine guns, and rapidly dwindling courage. The German infantry, sensing the collapse, surged forward with renewed confidence, their machine pistols and rifles spitting fire. Men in the American foxholes began to fall. The company's forward machine gun nest was silenced by a mortar round that landed directly in the emplacement, leaving nothing but a smoking crater. The line was no longer a line, it was a series of isolated, desperate pockets of resistance, each one being systematically snuffed out by the overwhelming tide of the German assault. Murphy saw it all happening. He saw the panic, the terror in the eyes of his men as they realized the utter hopelessness of their situation. The German infantry was less than 200 yards away and closing fast. The tanks were lumbering forward, their machine guns raking the tree line with methodical sweeps of fire. In another 5 minutes, his company, what was left of it, would cease to exist. They would be overrun, annihilated, a footnote in a daily report. His training, his instinct, every fibre of his being screamed at him to do something, anything. He grabbed the field phone that connected him to the artillery fire direction centre, his hand steady despite the tremors running through the ground. His voice was unnaturally calm amidst the chaos, a stark contrast to the screaming and ice, the explosions that filled the air. He gave the coordinates for a fire mission, not on the advancing Germans, but on his own position. He was calling down hellfire on himself. The artillery officer on the other end of the line paused, the silence crackling with disbelief. "Repeat that, Baker 6, the voice said. "Your coordinates are in the danger close zone." Murphy's reply was cold and absolute. "Just fire it." Then he turned to the handful of men still able to fight. They looked to him, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion, their eyes pleading for guidance, for a miracle. He gave them the only order that made any sense. "Fall back!" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. "Pull back to the secondary line in the woods. Go now." Some of them hesitated, their loyalty, to him, warring with their instinct for survival. They couldn't just leave him. "That's an order!" Murphy screamed, his voice raw with a fury that cut through their fear. "Move!" Reluctantly, the few remaining soldiers of Company B began to crawl and run back, deeper into the forest, leaving Murphy alone in his forward command post. He watched them go, a small, dwindling group of ghosts disappearing into the trees. He was now the only American soldier on this section of the front. He was the line. He fired his M1 carbine at the advancing figures until the clip was empty. He was one man against hundreds. He looked from his retreating men towards the burning, disabled M10 tank destroyer. It was a funeral pyre, smoke and flames pouring from its open turret, the ammunition inside likely to cook off at any second. But on top of that, turret was a .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun, still intact, with belts of ammunition hanging from its feed tray. An insane, impossible idea began to form in his mind. A final, desperate gamble, born of courage and cold fury. As the first shells from his own artillery began to explode around him, sending shrapnel whistling past his head, Audie Murphy slung his carbine over his shoulder and began to run, not away from the fight, but directly into the heart of it, towards the pillar of fire and smoke. He ran through a storm of his own making. The American artillery shells walked across the field, a rolling thunder of explosions that churned the snow and froze the air. Shrapnel whined past him, hot steel slicing through the fog with lethal indifference. He didn't flinch. His focus was singular, absolute, the burning M10. It stood like a pagan altar in the middle of the field, flames licking up its sides, the ammunition inside cooking off with sporadic, percussive cracks. To run towards it was suicide. To stay was annihilation. He chose suicide. The heat washed over him as he reached the vehicle, a physical blow that seared his lungs. The metal of the hull was scorching hot, the smell of diesel, burning paint, and cooked flesh a nauseating stench. He ignored it all. Using a towhook as a foothold, he pulled himself up onto the rear deck, the fire just feet from his face. The steel plates beneath his boots were dangerously slick with oil and melting frost. For a moment, he was a perfect target. A lone figure silhouetted against a backdrop of fire, visible to every German soldier in the field. From the German lines, it was a moment of sheer, surreal disbelief. Oberleutnant Richter, directing his infantry's final push, saw the small soldier climb onto the burning wreck. He assumed it was a wounded American, delirious and seeking death. "Ignore him," he barked to his NCOS. "Press the advance." But then the figure scrambled behind the big M2 machine gun on the turret ring. He chambered a round with a single, decisive pull. The German advance, which had been moving with the steady confidence of victory, faltered. Soldiers slowed, their eyes fixed on the impossible sight. A man had mounted his own funeral pyre, not to die, but to fight. And then the .50 caliber spoke. The sound was not the frantic chatter of a German MG-42. It was a deep, thudding, methodical roar. A stream of heavy, armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each one the size of a man's finger, tore across the snowfield. The effect was immediate and horrific. The first wave of Panzer Grenadiers, caught in the open less than 100 yards away, simply ceased to exist as a cohesive unit. The heavy slugs ripped through their bodies, tearing men in half, the incendiary tips igniting their ammunition pouches and greatcoats. Men who had been running forward 1 second were transformed into tumbling, burning heaps of cloth and flesh the next. The shock on the German side was palpable. They were professional soldiers, veterans of countless battles, but they had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a defense, it was an immolation. It was as if a demon had risen from the flames to hold them back. Richter's jaw tightened in fury. "All fire on the tank destroyer!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Destroy him!" The disciplined German fire, which had been suppressing the entire American line, now converged on that single burning point. Machine guns, rifles, and the coaxial MGs of the Jagdpanthers opened up, throwing a hail of lead at the M10. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off the steel hull around Murphy. The air was thick with the snap and whine of near misses. He didn't duck. He didn't flinch. He just kept firing. He traversed the gun in smooth, controlled arcs, picking his targets with the calm precision of a Texas squirrel hunter. A German machine gun team setting up on his flank was erased in a 2-second burst. A squad attempting to crawl forward through a shallow ditch was scythed down. He seemed to see everything, to anticipate every move. While his right hand gripped the spade grips of the M2, his left held the field phone to his ear. The artillery officer, his voice now tight with awe and concern, was still on the line. "Baker 6, we are hitting your position hard. You need to pull back." Murphy's reply was spoken in the lulls between bursts from his machine gun. "Just keep firing," he said, his voice level. He gave a slight correction. "Bring it in 50 yards closer." There was a stunned silence, then a hesitant, "Roger that, Baker 6. The American artillery intensified, the shells now exploding so close that the concussion waves rocked the M10, and shrapnel rained down on Murphy, clattering against the steel around him. A hot piece of metal sliced through his trouser leg, gouging a deep wound in his calf. He grunted, in pain, but never stopped firing. He was a conductor of chaos, directing 2 symphonies of destruction at once. The stream of .50 caliber rounds from his hands, and the rain of 105mm rounds shells from the sky, all centered on his own tiny, embattled position. Oberleutnant Richter watched in a mixture of horror and professional admiration. His attack was unraveling. His men were pinned down, unable to advance against the wall of lead and shrapnel. They were being systematically slaughtered by a single, seemingly invincible soldier. It was an insult to the art of war. "The Jagdpanther on the left!" he yelled into his radio. "Target the American. 1 round. Fire!" The commander of the tank destroyer acknowledged the order. The long 88mm cannon, a weapon capable of killing a Sherman tank from over a mile away, slowly lowered, aiming directly at the burning M10. The cannon flashed, and the high-explosive shell tore across the field. It missed the M10 by mere feet, slamming into the frozen earth beside it. The explosion was immense. The entire Tank D destroyer was lifted and thrown sideways by the blast. Murphy was hurled against the turret, the field phone knocked from his hand. The world went white, his ears ringing with a deafening roar. For a long moment, he lay slumped over the gun, motionless. A cheer went up from the German line. They had finally killed the devil in the smoke. But then, slowly, agonizingly, the small figure pushed himself back up. Blood was streaming down his face from a new wound on his forehead. His leg was on fire with pain, but his eyes were blazing with an unholy light. He grabbed the spade grips again, and he began to fire. That was the moment the German attack broke. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a rout. The sight of that lone, bleeding soldier rising from an explosion that should have vaporized him shattered their morale completely. The Panzer Grenadiers, their ranks decimated, turned and ran, seeking the safety of the woods they had just left. The Jagdpanthers, their infantry support gone, and still under a relentless artillery barrage, fired a few last, frustrated shots before pulling back, their heavy treads churning the bloody snow as they retreated into the fog. The roar of battle faded, replaced by the crackling of the fire beneath Murphy's feet, and the groans of the wounded scattered across the field. For what felt like an eternity, he remained behind the gun, his eyes scanning the empty, corpse-strewn field, making sure nothing moved. Then, slowly, as if in a trance, he let go of the machine gun. His legs, shaking with exhaustion and pain, gave way, and he slid off the hot steel of the M10, collapsing into the snow. He found the field phone, its line miraculously still intact, and spoke one last, quiet sentence into it. "The attack is broken. You can stop the artillery now." He had been on the burning tank destroyer for over an hour. He had fired every round of ammunition available for the machine gun. He had killed or wounded an estimated 50 German soldiers. He had single-handedly stopped an entire German division's assault. And then he began the long, painful limp back to his men. The surviving men of Company B, huddled in their secondary positions deeper in the woods, had listened to the battle with a growing sense of dread and disbelief. They had heard the continuous thudding roar of a single .50 caliber machine gun, a sound that had gone on, impossibly long, dominating the cacophony of the German assault. They had felt the ground tremble as their own artillery pounded the very position their commander had refused to leave. They assumed Murphy was dead, that he had fought to the last bullet in a final suicidal act of defiance. They were preparing for the inevitable German breakthrough, their own small band of survivors, the last speed bump on the road to Holtzwihr. Then, the firing stopped. An eerie silence fell over the forest, broken only by the distant sea, crackle of flames and the cries of the wounded. The men waited, their nerves stretched to the breaking point, and then they saw him. A lone figure, limping heavily, emerged from the smoke and fog-shrouded tree line. He was covered in soot and blood, his uniform torn, his face a grim mask of exhaustion. It was Murphy. His men stared, speechless. It was as if they were seeing a ghost. One of them, a private named Thompson, finally found his voice. "Lieutenant, is that you?" Murphy just nodded, his gaze distant, his body swaying with fatigue. He limped past them, his face pale and drawn. Only then did they see the extent of his injuries. Blood soaked his trouser leg from the shrapnel wound, and a fresh gash on his forehead was still oozing blood that mingled with the grime on his face. He looked like he could collapse at any moment. He walked over to the company's makeshift command post, leaned heavily against a tree, and began to organize a counterattack. It was an act of pure, unbelievable willpower. While the medics were trying to dress his wounds, Murphy, still in a state of shock but operating on pure combat instinct, refused to rest. He got on the radio, his voice raspy but clear, and began directing his men, coordinating with the other platoons, turning the German rout into a tactical victory. He led them forward, back through the carnage he had wrought, securing the position that just an hour before had been on the verge of annihilation. Only after the position was fully consolidated and he was certain the immediate threat was over did he finally allow the medics to properly treat him. As they cut away his trouser leg to get to the bleeding wound, he finally collapsed, his body succumbing to the pain, shock, and utter exhaustion of his ordeal. The full reality of what he had done only began to sink in when reinforcements arrived and officers from battalion headquarters came forward to survey the scene. The battlefield was a testament to one man's fury. The snow was littered with the bodies of German soldiers, their positions telling a clear story of an attack that had been stopped dead in its tracks. The burned-out hulk of the M10 sat in the middle of a field pockmarked with shell craters, its .50 caliber machine gun pointing silently toward the German lines. The ground around it was a brass carpet of spent cartridges. The officers, seasoned combat veterans themselves, looked from the carnage in the field to the small, boyish lieutenant being carried away on a stretcher, and they struggled to comprehend it. The story spread like wildfire through the 3rd Infantry Division. At first, it was dismissed as an exaggeration, a battlefield rumour. But as the eyewitness accounts from Murphy's own, men and the sheer physical evidence of the destroyed German attack were verified, the story took on the weight of legend. Here was a soldier who had called artillery down on his own head, who had climbed onto a burning tank destroyer that was a ticking time bomb, and who had, for over an hour, single-handedly fought off an entire German assault force of infantry and armour. Audie Murphy's war was over. His wounds were severe enough that he was evacuated from the front lines, never to return to combat. In the months that followed, as he recovered in a series of military hospitals, the United States Army tried to quantify his courage. They reviewed the sworn statements, the after-action reports, and the long list of citations he had already earned. For his actions on January 26, 1945, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for military valor. The citation, read aloud by President Truman during the ceremony, recounted the events of that day in stark official language that could barely do justice to the reality. It spoke of his indomitable courage and utter disregard for his own safety, phrases that seemed inadequate to describe a man who had willingly entered his own funeral pyre to save his men. When all his decorations were tallied, Audie Murphy was the most decorated American soldier of World War II. He had received every combat award for valor the US Army could bestow, including the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. The French government awarded him their highest honour, the Legion of Honour, as well as 2 Croix de Guerre medals. He was a symbol of the citizen soldier, the ordinary man who, when placed in extraordinary circumstances, performs superhuman deeds. He returned home to a hero's welcome, his face gracing the cover of Life magazine. He was small, quiet, and unassuming, looking even younger than his 21 years. He didn't look like a hero, and he certainly didn't feel like one. He was haunted by what he had seen and done, plagued by nightmares and the psychological scars of war, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow and suffered from insomnia and bouts of depression for the rest of his life. He embarked on a successful career in Hollywood, starring in over 40 films, including the 1955 classic To Hell and Back, in which he portrayed himself, recreating some of his most famous moments of the war. But the on-screen heroics were a pale imitation of the real thing, and the fame and fortune he found in Hollywood could never silence the ghosts of Sicily, Anzio, and the Colmar Pocket. Audie Murphy's legacy is not just in the medals or the movies. His true legacy lies in the quiet courage and fierce determination of a boy who was told he was too small to be a soldier, but who proved that heroism is not measured in physical stature, but in the strength of one's spirit. He was a symbol of a generation of men who were pulled from farms and factories and asked to do the impossible. On a frozen field in France, one of them did. The story of Audie Murphy on that January morning is more than just a tale of incredible bravery. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes, in the crucible of combat, one man, armed with nothing more than a machine gun and an unbreakable will, can indeed stand against an entire division and hold the line. His actions that day were not just heroic, they were legendary, a singular moment of courage that will forever be remembered in the annals of military history. The story of Audie Murphy is ultimately a story of contrasts, a narrative of impossible contradictions. It is the story of a boy judged by the standards of military bureaucracy to be too small, too slight, too physically insignificant to wear the uniform of a Marine or a paratrooper. He was the quiet, freckle-faced kid from a sharecropper's plot in Texas, a product of poverty and the Great Depression, who seemed destined for obscurity. He was the soldier his own commander tried to shield from the realities of combat, believing he lacked the physical fortitude to survive. Yet, it was this unassuming boy who would become the most lethal and decorated soldier in American history. On the German side, the contradiction was just as stark. They were the professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht, a military machine that had conquered a continent. They advanced with the confidence of veterans, supported by the terrifying might of Jagdpanther tank destroyers. They saw a fragile line held by a handful of exhausted Americans and anticipated a swift, brutal victory. What they encountered instead was a force of nature, a single, solitary figure who rose from fire and smoke to defy all the laws of warfare. They threw everything they had at him: machine guns, mortars, the high-velocity cannon of their most powerful armor. And he would not die. He was not a soldier, he was an apparition, a devil on a burning altar who single-handedly broke their will to fight. The true measure of his actions that day is not found in the cold, official language of the Medal of Honor citation, but in the stunned silence of his own men as they watched him limp back from a battle no one could have survived. It is found in the awe of the seasoned officers who surveyed the battlefield and could not reconcile the boyish figure on the stretcher with the field of carnage he had left behind. He had not just held the line, he had become the line. He had transformed a hopeless rout into a decisive victory through an act of will so profound it bordered on the supernatural. But the final, most poignant contradiction of Audie Murphy's life came after the war. He returned a hero, his chest heavy with medals, his name a household word. He became a movie star, recreating his own heroism for millions on the silver screen. Yet, the man who had faced down a German division without flinching could not defeat the enemies that followed him home. The war never truly ended for Audie Murphy. It lived on in the sleepless nights, the terrifying nightmares, and the deep, abiding wounds to his soul that no medal could heal. His life reminds us that the cost of such courage is immeasurable. The same fierce determination and cold fury that allowed him to perform superhuman feats on the battlefield became a heavy burden in peacetime. He was a living legend who was also a casualty of war, a man who had walked through hell and brought too much of it back with him. The ultimate legacy of Audie Murphy, then, is not just the story of the most decorated soldier, but the story of the soldier himself, an ordinary man pushed to extraordinary limits, who pays a price for his heroism long after the guns fall silent. He stands as an eternal symbol of the American citizen soldier, a testament to the incredible capacity for courage that can be found in the most unlikely of individuals, and a solemn reminder that the battles fought for one's country are often fought for a lifetime.